Starting this past weekend, Asia played host to the ASEAN-led gatherings, as well as the G20 summit, providing global leaders with the chance to engage on both multilateral and bilateral platforms. So what was exchanged during President Yoon's one-on-ones with his Japanese, US and Chinese counterparts? How are pundits responding to trilateral talks on North Korea's blatant brinkmanship? And what are the broader implications of the Beijing-Washington summit? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. There have been a number of high-profile exchanges here in this part of the world on the sidelines of regional summits. For more, I have Dr. Patrick Cronin from Hudson Institute here in the studio. Dr. Cronin, it's a pleasure to have you here.
It's great to be here, Sun-hee.
I also have Professor Min Jeong-hun at the Korea National Diplomatic Academy joining us live virtually, that would be, from the US. Professor Min, it's good to see you again.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Right, Dr. Cronin, we'll start here. So, like I said, a number of high-profile interactions. We'll start with a couple of them closer to home, that is here in South Korea. President Yoon Suk-yeol held his second summit with Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida. He held summit talks with U.S. President Joe Biden, and last evening that would be, he held one with Chinese President Xi Jinping before returning home early on this Wednesday morning. What, Dr. Cronin, are your takeaways from these summits?
Well, at a time when there's so much uncertainty around the world, it's an important time for leaders to talk to one another. So this is a vital time. And you've seen in these three summits you just mentioned that President Yoon is getting dividends from his reaching out to Prime Minister Kishida. I think there's reciprocity there from Japan, and we're starting to see this. I think we saw it in the trilateral statement, which I'm sure you'll explore later. I think President Biden and President Yoon have been extremely close from the beginning. And it's a moment right now when Seoul asks Washington and asks the White House for something. The White House is definitely listening. Not always giving everything Seoul wants, but this relationship is very close right now. I think with President Biden's meeting with Xi Jinping, President Yoon's, we'll talk about that in a minute, but President Yoon's meeting with Xi Jinping, here you have Xi on a charm offensive, and yet China is somewhat missing in action on North Korea, and I think President Yoon's pushing him, and then you see Xi Jinping pushing back, saying, wait, what about inter-Korean relations? So there's some give and take there, but it's still a good sign that they're talking.
Right. And as Dr. Cronin has mentioned, Professor Min, trilateral talks among leaders of South Korea, Japan, and the US were also held this past weekend over in Cambodia. What are your thoughts on the importance of this interaction, especially amid North Korea's blatant brinkmanship?
Yes, the leaders of the three countries met in Cambodia, and they talked about the main issues surrounding the Korean Peninsula and the region. And regarding North Korea, they expressed their concerns about North Korea's continued provocations and agreed to strengthen the trilateral cooperation against the North Korean threats. And President Yoon mentioned that North Korea launched about 50 missiles since he took office in May, and he also expressed concerns that one of the North Korean missiles crossed the Northern Limit Line NLL for the first time since the end of the Korean War, and it was a very serious provocation. And President Biden stressed the trilateral partnership with South Korea and Japan in order to respond to North Korea's continued provocations. And the Prime Minister Kishida also expressed concerns about North Korean provocations. And the joint statement was released after the summit meetings, and it shows that the three countries agreed to strengthen the deterrence against North Korea. Specifically, the three countries would coordinate sanctions against North Korea and work together to close gaps in the international sanctions regime to ensure that sanctions will be fully enforced. Meanwhile, they opened the door for the diplomatic talks with North Korea and urged Pyongyang to come back to the negotiations. In addition, the three countries will work together to strengthen deterrence against North Korea. President Biden reaffirmed that U.S. would reinforce extended deterrence to South Korea and Japan. And in order to strengthen deterrence, the three countries agreed to share real-time information about North Korea's missiles in order to improve each country's ability to detect and assess the threat posed by the incoming missiles. So overall, it is expected that security cooperation among the three countries will be strengthened in the coming months. Meanwhile, considering that the three countries expressed their intentions to strongly respond to North Korean provocations, it is likely that Pyongyang will continue to make provocations as scheduled. So I think personally that the security situation on the Korean Peninsula will be grave in the coming months.
Right. And Dr. Cronin, U.S. President Joe Biden also held separate talks with Chinese President Xi Jinping. That was yet another high-profile interaction right there. What purpose do you suppose did this particular summit between Mr. Biden and Xi Jinping serve?
Well, it's very important for these two big countries to figure out whether their competition is going to fly off into conflict or going to stay bounded. And I think it was very reassuring that they were able to have this kind of constructive engagement, even though nothing fundamentally changed. I think what's driving them forward, though, is Russia's nuclear taunts. And even though they disagreed about what to say in public, I think privately there's no doubt that Xi Jinping and President Biden agree there must not be even threats of nuclear use. They don't want to give any nuclear use sort of a chance. I think the disappointment about not talking about North Korea was felt by President Biden. He was hoping that this time Xi Jinping would engage. He didn't. Now, he did engage President Yoon. That's a good sign. But that happened after the fact. I think the Taiwan issue shows the gap that still exists in particular here. They have very different, stark visions of this. They both lay down their red lines, in effect. The only glimmer of hope here is that now they've agreed to follow through with principles, having a discussion of leaders or senior officials talk about principles that may build a process that builds the guardrails that contains the competition between U.S. and China. That's the hope.
Right, so essentially the communication channels are open then.
Yes.
Professor Min, do you suppose Mr. Biden's better than expected gains, so to speak, in the midterm elections back home, that is in the U.S., have perhaps provided him with a greater sense of momentum to perhaps engage or tackle his diplomatic agenda?
Yes, basically I think that based on the results of the 2022 midterm elections, I think that the Biden administration has a political momentum to pursue its major domestic and foreign policies in the next 2 years. Now, I also think that President Biden secured a favorable political environment to pursue his re-election bid in 2024. As you know, the 2022 midterm elections were considered as voters' evaluations on what the Biden administration did for the past 2 years. It is like the midterm report card for the incumbent president and the administration. And considering that the ruling party usually lost congressional seats in the midterm elections, the Democratic Party did a pretty good job in the midterm election this year. It is expected that the Democratic Party will maintain its dominance in the Senate, and it will minimize its defeat in the House. And the Democratic Party did a better job than expected. In the elections, it is important for political candidates or political parties to meet the expectations set by the media. And when candidates or the parties meet the expectations or do a better job than expected or beat the expectations, they receive the positive assessments about what they did in the elections. And in these midterm elections, public polls showed that there would be the red wave, and therefore the Republican Party could dominate both chambers of Congress. But the Biden administration and the Democratic Party did a better job than expected, and therefore I think they secured the political momentum to continue their political moves in the next 2 years. And for the Biden administration, I think it perceives the election outcome as voters' positive evaluations on what the administration did for the past 2 years. And based on the favorable assessment, the Biden administration will move forward to implement its major domestic and foreign policies to win the upcoming 2024 elections. Right. And regarding the foreign policy, I think that Biden administration will maintain its policy directions for the remaining term in office. And as you know, the Biden administration's foreign policy has got its priorities on Ukraine war, tracking the rise of China, and Iran nuclear deal. And there has been the bipartisan consensus in Washington that U.S. needed to support Ukraine against Russia's invasion and also needed to maintain its strong position and take strong measures to track the rise of China. So it is expected that Biden administration will continue to provide helping hands to Ukraine to successfully finish the war, and it will also continue to work together with its allies and partners to secure stable supply chains in high-tech and strategic industries and to maintain the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific region.
Right, and talking about supporting Ukraine from a Russian invasion, Dr. Cronin, there has been a rather unsettling event in East Europe. Reports claim a Russian-made missile reportedly struck that is eastern Poland, killing 2 people. That being said, what are the implications of this rather disturbing development?
Well, it's a very grave incident, and it needs facts to be found out. And we need to find out both the origins of the attack, whether it was Russia, and then if it was Russian or Russian forces, was it deliberate or was it an accident? That does matter. NATO has vowed to protect every inch of NATO territory. Poland is a NATO member, so a harsh response will be required if they've determined, if the facts conclude that this was a deliberate attack by Russia. This would be the very first attack from Russian forces onto NATO territory since Russia began this brutal war in February. You know, the general lesson here is that war is, creates great misery, and it spills over. It's not tidy, and that's what we're seeing happen. Hopefully this wasn't deliberate. Hopefully it was a tragic accident, and we can contain this. But if not, the harsh response is likely to lead to tit for tat, and who knows where this goes in terms of escalation.
And I know this is going to be a rather difficult question, Dr. Cronin, but when we talk about a harsh response, what options do we have?
Well, you can forward deploy forces in Poland, United States forces. You can give Ukraine and Poland and other NATO allies more weapons. For instance, armed drones is something that Ukrainian forces have been looking for. Or you could actually conduct some kind of a NATO strike on a Russian asset, whatever that means. Maybe Russians in Ukraine, in annexed parts of Ukraine, but nonetheless some kind of NATO mission. That could be very dangerous because that could be a slippery slope toward a NATO-Russian war.
Right, but first, as you said, we need to first determine the facts, though.
Yes, and they're determined to get to the truth out of this, and they've been very deliberate, and that's a good sign.
Right. Meanwhile, Professor Min, back on the local front, President Yoon is also scheduled to sit down with Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte here in Seoul on Thursday. That will be tomorrow, and Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez on Friday. What can you share with us about these upcoming summits, very briefly speaking?
Well, it's not clear what the leaders will specifically talk about in the summit meetings, but I think they will mainly talk about how they would enhance economic cooperation and cultural exchanges between them. As you know, the Netherlands and Spain belong to a group of European countries that possess advanced technologies and lead European efforts to maintain and improve their capabilities in those fields. And South Korea has advanced technologies and production capabilities as well. So they have been important business partners, and increasing economic cooperations could benefit both countries. So I think that the upcoming summit meetings would be a good opportunity that South Korea could enhance its economic cooperation and cultural exchanges with the important European partners.
Right. I suppose we'll have to wait and see what is being discussed then. All right, Professor Min, as always, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts. And Dr. Cronin here in the studio, thank you very much for your insights today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right. Well, that is all the time we have for this edition of Issues and Insiders. We'll be back tomorrow, same time. Join us then.